The book is called Behind Closed Doors, In the Room with Reagan and Nixon. It's the title of a memoir by a man who worked closely with both. Ken Khachigian, the author, was a speechwriter and a confidant to former Presidents Nixon and Reagan back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Near the end of his book, Khachigian, a lawyer who's based in California, writes, quote, "I spent a decade and a half in close confidential contact with these two presidents," end of quote. In 1990, when President Reagan and Nixon were together chatting about history, Khachigian kept notes of their conversation, which he reveals in his memoir. Ken Khachigian, at the end of your book, you talk about a meeting that you were in, took notes, and you had both Presidents Reagan and Nixon in the room. What did you learn, and when was it?
That was July of 1990, and it was 2 days before we were going to open the Nixon Library, and I was overseeing the opening of the Nixon Library for President Nixon, and he wanted to pay a courtesy call on President Reagan, and he asked if I would accompany him. Of course, I wasn't going to turn him down. So I joined him for lunch, and then we drove over to Century City and met with President Reagan for about, I think, almost 45 minutes, I think, as I recount in the book. I call the chapter, it's the last chapter of the book, and I title it The Lions Gather. And of course, they were the two lions of the Cold War, of the last quarter of the 20th century, the presidential giants and political legends of the end of the Cold War. And I learned how two different men relate. They had interacted during the time I shared with them. That's part of the story of my book that no one knew about, or very few people knew about, and now that I hope the whole world knows about, that they were rivals in 1968 because Nixon was wary of a Reagan candidacy. And but then in 1980, Nixon, after I joined the campaign with Reagan and having served with Nixon in San Clemente, Nixon saw the opportunity to advise Reagan informally through me as sort of a secret agent man, I called myself, as a courier. And Nixon wrote two memos during that campaign to Reagan. Actually, three different memos, two of them through me, and in October, and both of which are in the appendix of the book, both very lengthy memos, recommendations on political strategy and campaign talking points, as well as debate suggestions. And but in any event, in that meeting, getting back to the meeting, it was a little awkward at first because they're such different individuals. The chit chat was, Reagan was talking about the saddle he'd gotten from Annenberg, and they were talking about the opening of the libraries. So the meandering conversation was going off in different directions, and I thought, well, maybe I better intercede. And so I said, how did you two of you meet? And because I was curious, and Nixon jumped in and said, I remember it well. He says, you were testifying before the Un-American Activities Committee when Nixon was on the committee, along with Jack Kennedy, by the way. And when Reagan was head of the Screen Actors Guild, trying to ferret out the communists at the Screen Actors Guild. And Nixon actually said, I remembered the questions. I don't know if he really did, but he said he did. And then they got off onto the conversation and started talking about some very serious things about foreign policy and going back to the American past and talking about, and then about Gorbachev and the future. And then it became very, very interesting. And of course, I was taking very, very studious notes. I had my yellow pad with me, and I was almost transcribing it like a clerk. And so the chapter 25, the end of the book, is almost like a transcription of their conversation as best as I could do to capture it, because it would be like somebody in the 50s recounting, 40s recapturing a conversation between FDR and Roosevelt with these two men talking to each other. And then they warmed up a little bit, and then I think it was very cordial. And then as we drove back, Nixon said he observed that Reagan had grown from the time that he first knew him, and I thought it was a very interesting observation. So
you start off in the book. You talk about, of course, you talked about Richard Nixon first and how you worked with him on the Frost interviews. How well did you know him, and how did you get to know him?
It's interesting. I first met him as a college student, just bumped into him when he was campaigning for governor. That was just a casual meeting. And then when I was a Columbia Law student, I volunteered in his campaign for president by sending a letter to him at his law office that got me an interview with Pat Buchanan. And so who was an aide then to Nixon, and got me an interview with him. And so I volunteered answering correspondence and doing some research. And Marty Anderson, who was then on leave as a fellow from Hoover Institution doing policy research for Nixon, saw some value in this eager beaver law student, and in the spring of '68 offered me a job in the campaign of '68 working for Alan Greenspan, who was head of domestic policy research. So I didn't get to know Nixon personally, obviously, but I got to do work in that campaign, and that enabled me, after I finished law school, to get a job in the White House in '70. I can't say that I got to know the president personally because I was a junior staffer, but after the president resigned, it was obviously a very troubling time, and I had been one of the young warriors trying to fight off impeachment and Watergate allegations, and working closely with Al Haig and Ron Ziegler, names that are familiar to you but not to many of your listeners. They will if they read some of the history of those days and they read my book. But Ziegler went off to San Clemente with the president and called me after a few days after the resignation and asked me to come out and see if I could help. And so I came to San Clemente, and that was the first time I really got to meet with the president as a young 29-year-old staffer, and he was in need of help because he had no job, he had no income. They were after him for back taxes. They were after his law licenses in New York and California. There were subpoenas flying all over the place, looking for papers, and they were still hounding him. They weren't satisfied with him resigning. They wanted to persecute him, if not prosecute him. So I helped try to get his finances put together out there, and that's when I first got to meet him personally and learned a lesson in life, Brian. When I thought my career was, I thought my life had ended when at his resignation and all the defeat and desperation, and I felt so down and out, and sitting down with him and depressed because coming into San Clemente there was no big white top helicopter on the helipad anymore, and I sat down with him and looked over and sitting, and while he was sitting in his a brown chair that he loved, and he said, "You know what, Ken, don't get down. You've always got to look forward. We can't look back. Um, don't be down at all." He says, "We're going to we'll get past this." And I learned a big lesson in life, Brian. And that's you asked how I got to know him and what I learned from him, and that was how resilient Richard Nixon was and is, or was then, and as an individual, how no matter how bad they could beat him and how down that anybody else was around him, he was always prepared to move forward and not let anyone defeat him.
If you read your book, you're talking about mostly stuff that happened 40, 50 years ago. How did you keep notes all through your life?
Yes. I was an inveterate note taker. In every meeting I ever went to, any session I had, I kept notes, and I kept copies, and the originals are in the archives, and I kept copies, and what I had in San Clemente, those were my personal notes, and I kept diaries there after his resignation. And those were after every meeting I had with Nixon, I would go back to my office, and from my notes I would type up as quickly as I could notes for diary recollections to fill out my notes, so I could have a contemporaneous account of our conversation, because every one of those was so fascinating. And then in the '80 campaign, something very unique happened. Is a friend of mine gave me a cassette tape recorder and several mini cassettes, and I actually recorded into those mini cassettes as much as I could. After every evening we stopped. If I wasn't drop dead tired, I would record into those mini cassettes recollections of the campaign trail. So the first 6 chapters there are 6 chapters in the book of the 1980 campaign based on those diaries of actual recorded notes that I made into a cassette tape recorder, 35,000 words. Now those are in the archives. They're not public yet. I haven't made them public yet. But a lot of those diary entries are in the book. And then I also kept notes of conversations that President Nixon former President Nixon called on the campaign trail in 1980, and I made notes of those. Then in meetings I had with President Reagan while he was president, I was so used to taking careful notes, I tried to keep as verbatim as possible. And then because I was not a full-time employee at the White House, after I left in 1981, and I bicycled back and forth as what I called myself as a fireman throughout the 8 years of his presidency, I was able to keep my own records. So the conversations I had with him were very carefully kept notes. So I just kept a lot of records. And of course, in the '80 campaign, I kept every campaign stop, I kept meticulous records of every press release we had. And so I had huge file cabinet, probably 4 file cabinets full of everything I ever did, and plus both the Nixon and Reagan archives. The Reagan archives especially are just full of information. So combined with all that, it was, and having waited to write my book these 40 years or 50 years, or however you want to capture it, I was able to look at the oral histories of my colleagues and see these other biographies that were written, and it gave me a lot of perspective and a lot more information to base the book on.
So, what are we going to learn in the book that no one knows before you published it?
Well, the big thing I think they'll learn, they'll learn several things. I think probably the really big thing they'll learn is about Nixon's relationship with Reagan that was not known before in terms of these memos that he did in the 80 and 84 campaigns, especially in the 80 campaign, and that I reproduce in the appendix. But the way in which he made recommendations, the way in which he transmitted those secretly through me, but also the way in which Nixon related with Reagan throughout his presidency, but especially in that 80 and 84 campaign, and especially the nature of Nixon's advice. They'll be surprised to see how perceptive it was in terms of noting how the economy was in Nixon's mind the central issue in 1980 and 1984, that he didn't want Reagan departing from that. So that's one huge takeaway, is the Nixon thread that goes throughout the book. The second thing they'll learn, I think, is they'll see how there's a role that Mrs. Reagan plays in Ronald Reagan's life. Now that's previously known, of course, but it's being reported through my eyes, and it's reported through my eyes as reported in the 1980 campaign, and how important her role was, in bringing stability to his campaign, as I describe her as the unofficial chief of staff, to the extent that Bob Haldeman was Richard Nixon's chief of staff, and how she brought stability to the campaign, and how she also taught me, as Reagan's chief speechwriter in 1980, to give me assistance and telling me ways how best to for Reagan to communicate. So she was in a way my teacher to help me and make me learn to help, as she said, make Ronnie a better communicator, and that Ronnie, to make Ronnie speeches better, he has to be emotional. So I learned from her, and also how the extent to which she was his, I don't know how to quite put this, when Reagan had wanted to convey something that he was unwilling to convey personally to me, he often conveyed it through Mrs. Reagan. So if he had something he was concerned about, that his staff wasn't doing right, or that I wasn't doing right, maybe, and then he wasn't willing to say it directly to me, he would say it through her. Now he didn't expressly state that, but I could tell that when something came through Mrs. Reagan, that it was coming from him. So that's one of the threads in the book. The other thing that jumps out in the book is that that the Reagan internal staff was not as congenial as maybe people seem to think it was. and that Reagan came into office with a crusade in mind, and not everyone in his staff shared that crusade to the extent that he did. And people attached to him that didn't necessarily share his views of government or revolutionary thoughts about changing government. They didn't share his views on supply side economics, and tried to change his views in ways that sort of manipulated him. And the way I portray it in the book is that I think to a great extent, several members of his staff ended up being more viewed as serving themselves more than serving the president. That was the case of some people, and in others it was that it was sort of 50-50 serving the president and serving themselves, and a lot of them embellishing their own images at the expense of the president. And then there was a lot of, I talk about what I thought was leaking going on that was unfair to the president, that came directly from his White House. So I think those are some of the things that needed to be said. So I called the balls and strikes. Probably not that it will make a lot of people happy, but I think needed to be said. It's an honest book about what took place in the White House. It depicts what happens when power is attached to people that are so close to the Oval Office. Power is such an aphrodisiac. I can't remember who said power is the ultimate. Oh, I think it was Henry Kissinger who said power is the ultimate aphrodisiac. But it's such a huge attraction to people who once they get close to the president and close to that power, sometimes they adapt it too much to themselves rather to the president, and I think I exposed some of that.
You name names. For instance, you said that inside the White House, you knew that Dave Gergen was leaking to Bob Woodward. How did you know that?
Well, it became obvious afterwards when the book came out. You're talking about the Nixon years.
Yeah.
When the book came out, the Final Days book, a lot of the information that was in there came directly from information that could have only come from Dave, but also because Dave's call sheets, had Woodward's name on it a lot, and Dave and Bob had similar. They had similar backgrounds from their Yale years and Navy. Naval careers, and they, I don't know when they attached to each other, but Woodward saw him as a source, and Dave, Dave was just always very eager to talk to reporters, and he enjoyed talking to reporters, and he pursued that route all the way through that presidency at the end, and of course eagerly did it through the Reagan presidency, as I record in the book, and found a treasure trove of information that others had not found in the public in the papers that Sarah Fritz, the reporter for U.S. News and World Report, left behind in the Reagan archives. That Dave, was such an eager source for reporters. So it was, his fingerprints were usually indelible.
One of the people you talk about in the book is still alive and 94 years old, Jim Baker. The other has deceased, Dick Darman. But I want to read this sentence or two here and get you to put it in context. It was interpreted by Jim Baker and Dick Darman, both of whom made edits before the president ever saw it. Most were substantive regarding Reagan's record, but Baker made a conspicuous change. In California, Reagan instructed me to allude to school prayer and abortion. What are you talking about there, and where did Jim Baker and Dick Darman come into your life?
I think you're referring to Reagan's announcement speech when he declared for re-election.
Correct.
And that, I'm not making that up. That's actually in Jim's handwriting on the edits on my draft of the on Reagan's announcement speech for re-election. It's in his handwriting where he edits out the language for protecting the life of the unborn, and so that's there. I mean, there's no question of that. Jim alluded to that early on when we first talked, that he didn't want me to talk about social issues. I don't know if that was his own personal views or what. It conflicted with the president's personal views. I never felt that the staff, it was up to the staff to put their personal views to be imposed on the president's. And the president had instructed me implicitly to put those remarks into his speech, and for him to take it out, I thought was not proper. I probably should have brought to the president's attention that it was taken out, but I didn't, because I was pretty much a team player. As far as Darman, he came into my life that when I was, I never intended to come back to the White House, Brian. I mean, when the election was over in 1980, I just wanted to come back home to San Clemente and go to the beach and raise my kids again and start up my business. But President Reagan wanted me to come back as the chief speechwriter, and so they induced me at least to come back for the first few months and get the speechwriting stuff up and going and work on the inaugural address. And so at that point, and Darman writes in his own book, once he saw that Baker was going to be chief of staff, he knew Baker from their days at Commerce under President Ford. He seized on the opportunity to get back in government. He had nothing to do with the campaign. He was, I think, a consultant at one of the management consulting companies. He had no ideological views in particular, but he frankly loved power. He loved government and policy. So Baker brought him on because Dick was very bright, and he could do the kind of work that Baker, the day-to-day kind of chores that Baker had no interest in doing. So when I was in California, Darman called me up to manage my outside consulting budget, set me up and said, here's how we're going to work with you as an outside consultant working for the president, and here's your per diem, and here's this, here's that, and then he was set up as staff secretary, which I thought was pretty much a functionary's job within the White House. The staff secretary's job in the White House is, as I knew it, in the Nixon administration, which was operated by a fellow named John Huntsman, who ran a a wonderful company out in Utah, Huntsman Chemical. That job was pretty much just operating the paper flow in the White House, making sure that the paper flow to the president was staffed and people properly vetted all the policy papers and speeches and this, that, and the other. And that's what I saw Darman's role to be. But Dick came in and he saw this as an opportunity to expand his role. And Baker didn't put a leash on him. Baker basically allowed him to do whatever he wanted. So Dick began to impose himself in any policy area, and he's in speeches and I began to wonder why he was allowed to do this, because I just thought of him as a functionary, as a paper shuffler, and so that's how eventually we began to conflict with each other.
How much did he get under your skin?
Well, he got under my skin because the first time, as I describe in the book, like I say, his job was a staff secretary, and we were in a meeting in a policy meeting with Marty Anderson and I can't recall. I think it was with the economic advisor, the other economic advisor, and we were to discuss some policy matter, and Darman began inserting himself, and he was the staff secretary, and I asked a simple question. I said, I looked over to Marty Anderson, and I said, Marty, I thought this was your jurisdiction. I'm confused. I don't understand why Dick's even, I guess I wondered why Dick was even in the meeting. And you could see Dick he had an eruptive temper, which I'm not the only one that has written about this, by the way. It was written about widely, not just then, but by I'm not the only writer who's written about this. And he started just sort of steaming, and then after the meeting, he followed me out of the White House all the way across Executive Avenue, telling me about the business he was in, the business he ran, how in-depth policy decisions he had made in his life, and on and on and on, and chased me down. And so the conflict began from there. Now, what was unknown to me was that Dick Darman worked for Elliot Richardson. So he had something out for me to begin with that I didn't know about, because Elliot Richardson was fired by Nixon in the Saturday Night Massacre in October of '73, and Darman had been shoved out the door with Richardson. And later on, I don't have any proof, but later on I suspected that Darman was probably one of those leaking stuff along during Watergate with Richardson, but I have no proof of that. So.
Is it fair to say that there was a very deep divide between the Ed Meese group, which you would have been a part of, and the Jim Baker group? You thought differently about Ronald Reagan, about the policies, and you all were at each other pretty much through the Reagan administration?
Brian, we did work together pretty well. I have to say, we all generally worked together pretty well, but it was sort of in the off hours with reporters that, this wasn't my kind of role that I played. I didn't spend time in the bars and in late hours with reporters, spending time trashing other people on the staff. But it was, from the beginning, I think the Baker side of the operation, the former Bush guys, and Baker and Gergen and the others, and Baker especially felt that he had to make clear the divide between himself and Mies, and to draw his, mark his territory. And what made it more explicit was, again, as I said, there's a treasure trove of information. And Sarah Fritz, who was this reporter at U.S. News and World Report, I didn't make all this stuff up. And there's this treasure trove of information in the archives left by Sarah Fritz, who was a reporter at U.S. News and World Report, and she wrote what's called the Washington Whispers column in U.S. News, which was the gossip column. Newsweek had a similar column called the Periscope, that every week they wrote the gossip stuff coming out of the White House or the Capitol Hill or whatever. And they had, they would talk to people in the White House, for people talking behind other people's backs. And so Sarah left her papers to the Reagan archives and said, look, after my death, you can make them public, which was very rare. And no one had accessed them. But I found them when I was writing the book. And Sarah left all her background interviews with Baker and Darman and Gergen and Craig Fuller and Rich Williamson. And in these background interviews, it made clear that in one of those, Baker was explicit in an off-the-record interview where he was very negative about Mies, and in fact turned around the next day and called the reporter up and said, well, you have to be very careful not to make that public. That would harm our relationship. But I probably went too far saying all these negative things about Ed. But regarding the tax cuts, Baker's staff made it clear in all those off-the-record background interviews that they were working around the president, trying to make efforts to water down his tax cuts and the supply-side economics. And Darman made comments about how the Reaganauts were not very bright. The 50 or so special assistants to the presidents over in the executive office building were not very bright. And Reaganomics was not a very, really didn't work. And so they made all these comments off the record and in background. And so it was pretty clear that there was this divide between them, that they didn't quite believe in the crusade in the way, certainly in the way that Mises' side of the equation did, or Marty Anderson did. I came into this. I didn't view myself as an ideologue. In fact, before I joined Reagan on the campaign trail in '80, I wrote, and I reveal this in the book, that I wrote a memo to Marty Anderson that Reagan ought to. This is way before the campaign started, heating up. I said, this idea about the tax cuts, I don't think is a very good idea. But then, as I campaigned with Reagan, and then as I got more into the campaign and then into the presidency, I became an advocate. But then, more than anything else, Brian, it was the president's policy. It wasn't my policy. It was the president's. And if he believed in it, and it was his view based on ideas he had come up with over a period of 20, 30 years, that he dreamed up, especially from his years on the General Electric circuit, having believing strongly that taxes were way too high, Um, uh, so it was my belief that what if the president believed that, then he ought to be able to bring those beliefs and policies into effect. That it's not the staff's the staff has no right to try to impose their views on him. Now Baker had written in his own autobiography, he had made a comment that I thought was a comment against his own self-interest, where he had said that he had come to Washington to wield power, um, and I just to me that was uh, something that someone in his position he should have, his whole point in coming to Washington is to be chief of staff should have come to serve the president, not to wield power. And I think to a great extent, I think Jim viewed his position as wanting to make policy and to assert himself as chief of staff, and he inserted himself into the negotiations on the tax bill and everything else. I don't know that that's the chief of staff's job, but that's just my view. But he did a lot of that because he never believed. He told me right from the beginning, and I report it in the book, that the president may have to give up on the whole concept of supply side economics, and he said that in another interview, I think an oral history interview uh, with Princeton. So, but if he believed that, then he should keep it to himself and not try to impose it on the president. Uh, but his whole, but his staff were mainly out of the Bush side of the equation, and I would say that if Bush had his point of view, Bush would support the president because Bush was loyal to the president. But the staff people, and especially Darman had written in his own memoir that he didn't think that any of Reagan's policies that the people really didn't vote for Reaganomics per se. They just voted for they voted for the aura that Reagan brought into the campaign. They didn't really vote for the notion of the revolution that he brought. So it was a very confusing period. But mainly my concern was that they worked around him, and that's reported in that one chapter, and I document it pretty much. And I don't think anybody. I don't think a lot of my colleagues disagree with me. I'm getting a lot of reports from a lot of my colleagues that they're pleased with that I wrote the book the way I did.
Why did you wait 50 years to write this?
I get asked that a lot. The main reason is I had to make a living. I had to earn an income and make a living, and writing a book was not the way to do it. And the second reason is I came back from the White House not only to make a living, but a lot of people don't know that quite apart from working at the national level with President Reagan, I came back to California and I ran a gubernatorial campaign for Governor Duke Majan in 1982. So in the off years, I started getting involved in California politics very actively. So in the off years, I'd be involved in California politics. In 1986, I once again ran Governor Duke Majan's campaign. I helped with Pete Wilson's senatorial and gubernatorial campaigns. I helped run school choice campaigns twice, school voucher campaigns. I ran campaigns for Dan Lundgren for Attorney General on 2 occasions. Helped Bruce Hershenson ran his Senate campaign in 1992, And I've been involved in California politics very heavily all those years. And in the meantime, like I say, I had to make a living. So I was traveling to Sacramento back and forth, traveling to Washington back and forth, and I never found time to sit down and write. And writing is your program is called, I think, the Booknotes.
Yes.
And if anybody that tries to write a book, they'll see that just putting down that first word is the hardest thing in the world. And it took me 4.5 years to write this, Brian. And I rewrote it and rewrote it. I cut 35% of the book in editing. I was concerned about how it read. I've been told by my friends that I've had a lot of people actually read the whole book. A lot of people don't read the whole book, but I've been told by people that it's very readable. I tried to make it very readable. I don't want people to be bored with it. I wanted it to be lively reading and interesting reading. So it's I couldn't just do it. I had to make it a well-researched book, a thorough book. I had to make it so I could defend it if people questioned it. So it wasn't just and one thing I found was that some of my memory had changed. Some of the things I remembered, I misremembered from like my oral history at the University of Virginia. I didn't remember things quite correctly, and when I sat down to write this book, and I had all my files and all the recollections of my diaries in front of me, I was able to correct a lot of the things from the actual notes and detailed recollections that I had that had dates on them and everything else, and that if necessary I could go back and recollect, and if necessary go back and find clippings or something like that. So this is a very well documented book, 4.5 years of documentation, so that people will have. This is not a political polemic. It's a U.S. history book. It's a history of politics in the 70s, 80s, and into the early 90s. And I think it's almost. I don't mean to be prate myself, but I think this book would serve as a really good history book in a political science class or a speech writing class, because that's another. You asked what a takeaway from it is. For anybody who wants to know what it's like to be a speechwriter, this is a lesson in speech writing, because I write about what it's like to write under pressure in speech writing in a campaign, which is really hard, and what it's like to have only 40 minutes to write something while an airplane is on the final approach to landing at a campaign stop and the candidate is wondering where the speech is, or an event happens overnight and somebody wakes you up at 6:30 in the morning and says, we've got to have a statement, a new statement, or you have to work until 3 or 4 in the morning on speeches, or you have to write an inaugural address, and you've never written an inaugural address in your whole life. How do you do it? So there's a lot of studies in speech writing, I think, that students can learn from. I don't necessarily think I'm a gifted writer. I think I work hard at it. But I try to. I'm maybe meat and potatoes, but I try to learn. I think the book tells about the progression of how I learned how to write, and what I learned from Nixon and Reagan during that process.
How disappointed were you that you didn't write the farewell address for Ronald Reagan?
Well, I was crushed.
What happened?
It's you know, if you're if you were told that you were going to be the captain of the Super Bowl team and be the quarterback at the Super Bowl, and given that assignment, and then somebody surreptitiously took that assignment away from you after asking you to commit yourself to train for it and prepare for it for half a year, and then took that assignment away from you, anybody would be disappointed. And
who took it away from you?
Well, a combination, I suspect. I think it was perhaps a combination of the chief of staff then, Ken Duberstein, and maybe Mrs. Reagan was. I think she was unhappy with what happened at the 1988 speech at the convention for different reasons. She perhaps wanted the president to deliver his farewell address at the convention to be different than what he did, and maybe thought that that was something that I had a hand in, and although I worked on that speech with him, I tried to impress in the book that it was, that speech was not my speech, it was his speech, and he decided to deliver it the way he wanted. It was not, and at the end of the day, it was not. I didn't impose that speech on President Reagan at the convention. And it didn't come over well at the convention because of a lousy sound system. And so 3 days later, George Bush delivered a lovely speech. So she saw the contrast and maybe thought maybe the president needed a different. And Duberstein. I don't know. I mean, I don't know how the decision was made. Mrs. Reagan destroyed her diaries, but I also viewed Duberstein as one that he's the one that asked me. He and Howard Baker asked me to commit to write the farewell address, and Tom Griscom and all the three of them, made me swear, short of swearing on a Bible, that I had to commit to writing the farewell address. They dragged me up to Los Angeles, and in fact, they wanted me to take the entire year of 1988 off. It's in the president's diary that he would like me to take the entire year of 1988 off to edit all his speeches for the year. So. It's clear that I was going to be asked to do, and his diary shows that they asked me to do the 3 big speeches for him. So somewhere along the line, the decision was made to take me off the assignment, and so yes, I was unhappy. Like I said, if you're asked to quarterback the Super Bowl and somebody takes you off the team, then nevertheless, it was what it was, and I told the president I was unhappy, and he was apologetic but in sort of an awkward way.
You quote Paul Gigot, who runs the editorial page for the Wall Street Journal, about Ken Duberstein, who is also deceased, was a lobbyist in town. You say the truth, Gigot did. He said, the truth is that Mr. Duberstein is a perfect Washington weather vane, a beltway fixer who makes his living from influence peddling. The betrayal of an old friend can be written off as a cost of doing business in Washington. Did you work with Ken Duberstein at all? And you think in your own, basically what you're saying is that he was the one that derailed it, or was it Nancy Reagan?
Well, I think I think he, I think he was a co-conspirator, and what my problem was with Ken on this was that he didn't have the integrity to call me up himself after being participant in the assignment to ask me to do the farewell address. That he didn't have the integrity to call me up and say, Ken, I'm sorry, we're going in a different direction, and I know we asked you to write the farewell address. I know you've probably spent time preparing for it, and I did. I have a whole file here right in my office called the farewell address file. I know you've probably spent time on it. You've probably put some creative thinking into it, and I know you've worked on it, and I know it's important to you. And so, but we've changed our mind, and that's the way things are. But he didn't have the courage and integrity to pick up the phone and make that phone call. That's what bothered me as much as anything. I didn't expect the president to call me. That's not his style, and maybe I didn't expect Mrs. Reagan to call me either. She shouldn't have to, but he should. That's his job as chief of staff, and so yes, betrayal was that's part of his MO. He also betrayed John McCain when he shifted gears and endorsed Barack Obama.
You do have this short note from Ronald Reagan's diary. I did most of the work on the speech myself. That's the president saying that. I got a little help in typing from that young girl. She happened to be around. In parentheses, you put this in there, referring to Peggy Noonan. Did Noonan write that, or was that, what was your reaction when you saw that note?
Well, that was actually in his phone call to me.
Oh, it was. Okay.
Yeah, that was his phone call to me. That was his way of just sort of trying to. It was. He just wanted to paper over the decision. It was not his decision. I don't think it was his decision not to call me in. It was a decision made for him. Duberstein said, probably said, Mr. President, we're gonna, I'm not even sure he said, we were gonna have Ken do it, but we've decided to have Peggy do it or something like that. But I just think it was presented to him as a fait accompli, and when I wrote him a letter and said how disappointed I was, he wanted to paper over it, and so he wouldn't hurt my feelings. So he came up with this sort of a lame kind of excuse, saying, "Oh well, I actually wrote it all myself," and said that young girl just helped me with the typing, and I didn't, that was not a believable statement, but it made him, I think it made him feel better.
One last couple quickies. You say that Stu Spencer, who was very much involved in the campaigns, that you knew him well, and you talk about him a lot in your book, used to call you Meanian.
That was Jim Brady.
Oh, I'm sorry. Jim Brady called. Oh my goodness, I missed that.
Yeah, Jim Brady called me Meanian.
And why?
Yeah.
What's the backstory on that?
Well, because my heritage is Armenian, and so Brady had a nickname for everyone. And my nickname was Meanian, so he dropped the AR off of Armenian, and he called me Meanian. He had a nickname for everybody. He was such a scalawag. He's a naughty boy. But after he would call me up if there was this breaking story, he'd call me up, wake me up. The phone would jangle at 6 o'clock in the morning in my hotel room. Hey, Meanian, wake up. You got to get up and write something today.
Our guest has been Ken Khachigian. The name of the book, it's a memoir, is Behind Closed Doors, In the Room with Reagan and Nixon. Thank you, Ken Khachigian.
Thanks a lot, Brian. So good to talk to you again.
Thanks for listening to the Booknotes Plus podcast. Please rate and review Booknotes Plus, and don't forget to follow so you never miss an episode. Questions or comments, we would love to hear from you. You can email us at podcasts@c-span.org.